certain rules. So the objectives tonight, we're going to talk about garlic specifically, and then we'll have the site considerations, soil planting, and care of spring bulbs. So let's go ahead and get started. Now keep in mind, when we talk about spring bulbs, there are a lot of things that we talk about that aren't really bulbs. We've got tubers and corms and rhizomes and tuberous roots in addition to the bulbs, and we all just kind of lump those into spring bulb category. So don't yell at me if I say spring bulbs and I talk about irises. So spring bulbs, then we have a hardy type spring bulbs. You plant them in the fall. Typically they require a vernalization, which is a chilling period, not a freezing period necessarily, but a chilling period. And then they bloom in the spring and early summer. And then there are the summer bulbs, which are more tender, and that's the things like the dahlias and some of those that don't tolerate the frost. You can't keep them in our soils over the winter, and they'll give you typically a good long summer and fall blossoms. But we're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about spring bulbs. Now this is garlic, so I was just going to play this video because I talk about planting garlic, and so I'm Ron Patterson with Utah State University Extension in Carbon County. Garlic is a great crop to plant in the high desert country of Utah, and there are some of the reasons that make it so is because you can plant it, well you should plant it in the fall, and you harvest it about mid-July, maybe early June to mid-July, depending on when it tells you it needs to be harvested. Then you can do a second crop of peas or some short season, cool season crop for late summer, early fall kind of crop. So garlic is a great crop, and besides, there's nothing better than fresh garlic in some of your recipes in the house as opposed to the powdered garlic or garlic salt. Now I've got some of these furrows dug. You're planting in the fall. I had to stop my fall cleanup work because it's time to get some garlic planted. So I've got some furrows dug here, and I've got a marker that I will use. I just make these little tags out of a pop can, just cut a strip, so I know my varieties that I've got in each row. We have a fair amount of moisture in the ground now, enough to get the roots started. You plant them in the fall, the roots start growing. In the spring, the tops will come up. They're one of the first things to come up. They tolerate the freezes and the frosts very well. And so that's what we like to do, make sure we've got the moisture, high organic matter content. It'll tolerate various soil types, so you could have a fairly high pH or not very high pH, or a sandy soil or a clayey soil, and garlic will do quite well in those as long as you've got high organic matter and you get enough moisture and nutrient on them to get a good bulb. If you're not ready to plant it right away, just put it in a paper bag for a while to store it, and it will store just fine until you're ready to go. What you're going to do is you're going to plant a clove of garlic. So you just break it off from the bulb like that. This is the root end, so that's the end that you want to plant downward in your furrow. And the best cloves will be these on the outside row. So you get your garlic out, you separate it out. When you get to these in the middle, these will probably be okay. These are in pretty good shape, but you get to where they are actually kind of divided but not quite yet divided, and they won't go, so you can just use that for eating and you don't have to worry about planting that. So get your garlic. Once you're ready to do your planting, get your garlic and break apart your bulbs. If you have different varieties, then keep them separate so that you know which ones you've got planted where, and then you'll be able to plant them and know what you've got coming up in the summer. So I don't know if you can see this or not, but you'll see there's almost two root plates in this one. This would end up being kind of a double bulb, so I don't want to use that one. Your bulb, you got the pointed end as the top. This is the root plate right down here at the bottom. So when you plant them, that's the direction you plant them. One more thing to think about as you're doing this, you've got this paper cover on the outside if you've harvested your garlic correctly, if it's been correctly harvested. But each one of these cloves also has a covering too. You do not peel that covering off. Leave this covering around the garlic clove on so that it's just like that. Don't expose that to the elements. With the hardneck garlic, a lot of times you'll get the flower come up there, and if you let those produce, they'll actually produce these little tiny bulbules. They're just little tiny garlics that you can plant in the ground. When you plant those in the ground the first year, after that first season they'll come up as a single bulb like that, then you plant them again. So it's actually a 2-year process if you start with these hardneck garlic bulbules from the flower. So this one would then produce into a garlic like that the second year that you plant it. Since I have several garlic varieties, I want to make sure I mark each one, so then when I harvest, I know which ones that I've got, and I can keep them straight and keep them the same seed from year to year and know what I've got. Now that I've got the garlic cloves separated out, we'll just plant these, and you just plant your root plate end down. You want to plant your garlic so that there's going to be 1 to 3 inches of soil above the garlic. You don't want it too shallow. It's not like onions. Onions you kind of plant on the surface. Garlic you want to plant down deep. And so we've just got a lot of garlic to go. Then you cover it up like that. Get you good 3 inches of garlic or so. And that garlic's ready to go for the next year. So just a few pointers. Again, if your fall weather has been dry, you'll need to get some moisture in the ground before you get your garlic planted, or right after you get it planted, so the roots have got something to grow into. You want to plant before the ground freezes, after the frost kills everything else, but before you get the heavy frost and freeze on the ground. And then in the springtime, if you've had an open, dry winter, you'll need to get water on your garlic as soon as it starts popping up. Make sure that you've got moisture on there so that it'll grow well and do good in the springtime as well. So you kind of have to watch that moisture quite well. It doesn't hurt if you want to put 2 or 3 inches of mulch on top of your garlic after you've got it planted. That's not a bad idea too. The organisms will pull that down in the soil and increase the organic matter content of the soil as well. So those are just some points to have good, healthy, successful garlic patch. In the springtime, it'll be one of the first things to come up in the spring. You'll get the garlic spears kind of coming up, and they'll be freezing still. It'll be in April or maybe late March. The garlic will come up, be all exciting to have your garden growing, and then in late June, early July, you harvest your garlic and you're ready to go for another year. Spring bulbs. So that was the garlic thing. Now keep in mind, I guess I should mention this at this point. Idaho has quarantine rules regarding garlic. Any live allium plant parts that are brought in for production, they have to go through a quarantine and an inspection to test whether or not they've got this white rot disease. We grow a lot of onions in Idaho, and Bonneville County is one of those counties that has this quarantine law. And the reason for that is that so that if you want to produce garlic, especially garlic is the one that's most affected because you don't grow garlic from seed. If you want to produce garlic, you have to have it inspected. You have to be a certified supplier. And if you're in Bonneville County then, and you have it inspected, you can sell to these other counties that have the quarantine, in addition to the counties that don't. There's 20 or 21 counties that have this quarantine rule or law. And because of that, these out-of-state suppliers cannot ship garlic into Idaho. Because of the quarantine laws, it's kind of hard sometimes to find garlic. And so that's the biggest challenge for most people to grow garlic, is they need to get that garlic from a certified producer that produces that disease-free garlic.
Ron?
Yeah.
I have some heads of garlic that I bought at the farmer's market this summer. Is it safe to plant that?
Legally, no.
Okay, but if it was grown in Bonneville County, that doesn't necessarily make it safe?
Not necessarily. There are producers in Bonneville County who have the white rot in their soil.
That's what I was going to say. I have an acquaintance in Bonneville County that grows a couple acres of garlic, and she sells at the farmer's market and other places, and she does have the white rot in her garlic. So you never know.
And legally, again, you're not allowed to buy garlic at the grocery store and plant that. And that would be even scarier because you have absolutely no idea. A lot of that's grown in California. And so let's move on beyond that. Now the spring bulbs, we're talking, these are the tulips and the daffodils. This was kind of a fun picture to take. The hyacinths, the great hyacinths, the crocus, the lilies, snowdrop, anemones. These are typically what we refer to, and there are a few others when we talk about spring bulbs. And now keep in mind, some of them are not, I don't even have irises on there. Irises would fit into the same category. Some of them are tubers and some of them are bulbs and whatnot. So, all right, so let's talk about with these spring bulbs, site selection. Most of your spring bulbs do best in full sun. A lot of them can tolerate the light shade, most particularly because they're coming out so early in the spring that if you're under a deciduous tree, the leaves haven't come out on the tree yet, and so there's still quite a lot of sunlight, and so they'll do okay and they'll regenerate quite well. But they do best in full sun. If you plant them under shade year after year after year, eventually the energy stores in the bulb will decrease, and you'll get less and less bulb, fewer flowers, fewer plants in there. And so that's where full sun is best. It's the slope, if it's got a slight slope, that's better than flat land, but the bulbs do quite well. So you can put them on, even just if you've got them on a raised bed or something like that, just to kind of let that cold air shed off. But really what that's going to do mostly is just kind of delay the bloom in those colder spots. And so you'll get bloom up on the slope, and then down in the low areas, you'll get less bloom or very little bloom, or later bloom, I guess, not less, but later bloom. And so that's why you kind of want to avoid the cold areas if you can, but it's not critical as far as the survivability of the bulbs typically. So soil requirements, usually the high organic content is very, well, that's very important. They prefer that high organic content. Now the pH, the best pH is between 6 and 7, and this is where the organic content can actually help out, because having high organic matter will lower your pH for a longer period of time than trying to do something like sulfuric acid or elemental sulfur or something like that. So the pH, if putting organic matter on there, will help to drop your pH down. And if you can get below 7, then that's pretty good around here. Drainage, water. You don't want, they don't like to be sitting in puddles. So you want to have soil that drains really well. If you have a heavy clay soil, again, adding organic matter will help with that. If you've got a sandy soil, drainage is not an issue, but then water might be an issue. And so, but with that drainage, you just don't want water puddles around there. Now for fertilizing it, this is are the recommendations for 10 square foot spot. First of all, do a soil test to see how you're doing on the phosphorus and potassium. Nitrogen you'll probably need to add. Anyway, if you have plenty of phosphorus and potassium, then don't go with the 10-10-10. You don't need to add the phosphorus and potassium, which are the second and third numbers. Nitrogen is the one that you need to focus on a little bit. But you don't want to put too much nitrogen down, because then that would delay or stop the blooming, and you get too much vegetative growth and not very good on the flowering growth. So at fall, when you're planting in the fall, for a 10 square foot area, a quarter cup of 10-10-10, or a couple tablespoons of an eighth of a cup, I guess that's about 4 tablespoons of ammonium sulfate. If all you have to do is nitrogen, ammonium sulfate down there would work well. Now, planting. So we got the soil worked up, we've got the site selected and the soil worked up. Planting. After the frost, you have a killing frost in the fall, but in eastern Idaho, late September to mid-October is a really good time for planting the bulbs. You want to get them in the ground so the ground is still soft enough, not frozen, so you can still work it, get the bulbs in the ground, and then get them covered And they'll develop the roots. They'll send out their roots in the fall and go through that vernalization. And then in the springtime, you've got that good foundation for them to grow. So plant them after the frost, your depth and spacing. This is kind of a fun, an interesting 2.5 to 3 times. And it depends on who you're listening to or who you read. Some of them say that measures from the bottom of the bulb, and others will say that measures from the top of the bulb. You know, typically for seeds and even for bulbs, you're looking at about 3 times of the soil over the top of whatever it is you're planting, but you don't want to get them too deep. So on a bulb, you know, you're looking at 4 to 6 inches for your daffodils and tulips, and your crocuses, you're going to look at 1 to 2 inches on a crocus, 1.5 inches to maybe 2.5 inches on a crocus. So that's kind of the rule of thumb there.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah.
Just something else to think about with the fertilization is a lot of people will plant those spring bulbs so that they come up in the spring, and then they plant either annual flowers or sometimes even have perennial flowers that come up as those bulbs die off. And you just have to remember that when you do that, you're going to need even more fertilizer, because that many plants competing in one space, they kind of leach it all from the soil, or more organic material too.
Yeah, that's a good point. The easiest way that most people say, if you're going to plant a lot of bulbs, you know, they have those bulb planters with the thing you push down, you dig out a big divot and put your bulb in and then put the soil over the top. If you've got a lot of bulbs, that's very tedious, and especially if your soil is hard to work or it's very sandy and it doesn't stay in that bulb extracting soil digging thing. So a really good way is to just dig out that area, however big of an area you're going to do, and stick your bulbs down into it and then put the soil back over on top of the bulbs. That works really quite well fast when you're doing it that way. You can do it with a garden trowel. I've done that. If you got one that your soil is really workable, you can dig that down and put that in that. Be sure that you have the nose up. Like I was talking with the garlic, the pointy end goes up. Again, good drainage. And then after you get them in place in the fall, water them in. You don't want them waterlogged, but you really need to get that soil to settle in around the bulb, so when the roots come out, they're going to go out into that native soil and get a good foundation. So water them in. Now, once they start coming up, when the foliage appears, we want to make sure that we have adequate moisture. Water them in, especially if we've got a low rainfall, not a lot of moisture in the springtime and things like that. When you water, you need to water deeply. Remember, you've planted these bulbs deeply. They should be 4 to 6 inches deep, depending on how, you know, which bulbs you crocus or whatever, but it'd be shallower. But you want the moisture down where the roots are. So watering 1/4 of an inch is not going to cut it. Watering 1/2 inch probably won't cut it. You need to water about 1 inch every time you do it, but don't water too often. Again, depending on the soil type, springtime, you're not using up a lot of moisture. The wind might suck a little bit off the top, and so that's kind of an issue sometimes. But the water needs to get down into the root zone. So 1 inch of water, most of our soils around here will hold 2 inches of water in a foot of soil, and you want to work on the top half of the gas tank. And so if the soil is wet, don't worry about it. If the soil is getting a little bit dry, you want to put down 1 inch and then let it get dry and then put down 1 inch. Don't water 3 or 4 times every week in the springtime, especially. I already talked about that. Fertilizing. The fertilizer during the growth and the bloom. Now we talked about a 1/4 of a cup on a 10 square foot area with your during the growing season, you want to put down a 1/2 cup, but you don't want to put it all down at the same time. So a 1/2 cup, you split it up in 2 or 3 different times during that growing season. So in the springtime, when they first start sticking their nose up out of the ground, put down some fertilizer. Again, that's that 10-10-10 is what we're talking about. So do that, and then you do it again as they're budding out, and do it again actually towards the end of their blossom. Now try to keep it off the leaves, the fertilizer off the leaves, get it down on the ground, worked into the ground, watered into the ground, and that's a good fertilizer thing to do. Now, here's the thing where most people have the biggest problem with their bulbs. You want to deadhead them, but you're only taking off the flower stem. Now, daffodils are really quite easy because you can just take off the flower stem and you got those leaves coming up from the ground. And it looks kind of grassy like. The tulips, you deadhead those, and they're kind of ugly-ish, and so you leave that foliage there, and it's okay, but it's not providing anything colorful other than green, and so leave them there until they die back. If you do that, what those leaves are doing is they're getting energy. They're building up reserves, the reserves back into the bulb, so you can come back year after year after year, and you get a lot better results from the bulbs. You lot longer life of the flower bed if you do that. Now, what we used to do down at the temple there is we let the foliage out, we deadhead those, and about the time we deadhead them, we'd be planting in between the bulbs, we'd be planting annuals and let those greens stay there. And then about the time they start to die down, the leaves are about died down, so we take them off. And all of a sudden, you've got the flowers there, and the people would say, wow, how'd you do that? There was this growth. Now, all of a sudden, you have all these pretty flowers here. Well, it's just kind of a timing thing. So let the growth go there. Plant your plants in between that you're going to do. And then when they finally die out, take them out, and people will be amazed. We never saw any bare ground there. You get these beautiful flowers coming along already. Now, if you're going to divide them after a few years, it may be that you've got lots of greenery, but there's not a lot of flowers coming up. It could be that they're just crowded, and it happens a lot with daffodils especially. You get too many of them growing, they're dividing. They do their own dividing down there, and so you may need to dig them up. If you're going to dig them up and to divide them after the foliage has died down, make sure you mark where they are so you know where they are. After the foliage has died down, divide those and then replant them immediately. You don't have to wait till fall. You can wait to fall if you want to, but you just replant them immediately and they'll do really well. Okay, so that's it. Questions?
Yeah, so do I plant my dahlia bulbs and my gladiolus bulbs now too?
No. Dahlias and gladiolus, those are the warm season type, and so you want to plant the dahlia tubers and the gladiolus corms. They're not bulbs technically, but plant those in the springtime about the time, well, you want your soil temperatures to be up around 60 degrees usually for those, but you can get those planted when about the time of your last frost. The soil should be warming up pretty good, and they should be coming up then after the last frost, and so they won't be harmed by it. The dahlia tubers they'll tolerate a little bit of cold temperature, but they won't survive through the winters here. And same thing with the glads. They just require a little more maintenance. Same thing with the tuberous begonias. They're a tuberous root. And so, yeah, those tender plants, you don't plant those in the spring or in the fall. Plant them in the springtime.
Ron, could we go back to garlic, about fertilizing garlic?
You can fertilize them really about the same way you do these bulbs we talked about.
What about suggesting a sequence of bulbs so that you get like maybe crocuses or snowdrops, and then you get daffs, and then you get tulips, so that you get a longer season of bulb blooms?
What do you recommend on that, Lena?
Well, those squill that I put on there, those come up between the crocus and the daffodils. That's one of the reasons I like them. They kind of fill in that awkward gap. So I know we're not supposed to promote any like businesses or anything, but there's a company called Color Blends, and I'm not saying you need to buy anything from them, but their catalog is awesome at telling you at each different variety and cultivar exactly when in the spring they will bloom. You can look at that catalog online, or you can order it free online. And I use that almost like a reference guide at home, whether I'm buying bulbs from them or from somewhere else, because it tells you the timing of everything. And they also suggest different blends of things you can put together for that blooming sequence. So I would look into that, because I have some daffodils that bloom after my tulips are done, and some tulips that come in up, right after the crocuses are finishing, that they're all different times, so you got to know each flower.
And keep in mind the size of the bulb is important. The bigger bulbs, you know, the tulip bulbs that are bigger are going to be more, they're going to have the flowers in them. As they get older and smaller, or if you go buy some bulbs, buy the bulbs that are big and good quality. You want to make sure that they don't have any rot in them, or they don't have any dings on them, you know, damage to them, mechanical damage. Buy good quality bulbs and you'll be more satisfied with what you get in the springtime.